The chief advisor on vaccine passports in Ontario has a declared conflict of interest, but does anyone know about it? It looks like we have to file another access to information request to try to find out. Tamara Ugolini here with Rebel News, and I've reported twice already on Ontario's Chief Medical Officer of Health, that's Dr. Kieran Moore, and his own declared conflict of interest with pharma oligarch, documented fraudster, and main COVID injection manufacturer, Pfizer. He declared it himself when he was a panelist in the University of Toronto's commissioned presentation titled Changing the Way That We Work, that essentially gave talking points to physicians whose patients had questions around the vaccine rollout.
Have an honoraria from the Ontario College, and I'm on the advisory board of Pfizer for their Lyme disease North American strategy.
At that time, Moore was still the local medical officer of health in Kingston and was then described as a member of Ontario's COVID-19 vaccine distribution task force. Moore himself declares that he is principal investigator for the Canadian Lyme Disease Research Network and that he is on the advisory board of Pfizer for their Lyme disease North American strategy. I had previously filed an access to information request, also called an ATIP, to obtain the documents surrounding the financials of the Canadian Lyme Disease Research Network, or CLDRN, of which Moore is a principal investigator. The CLDRN was born from a partnership between the Canadian Institute of Health Research and the National Research Network for Lyme Disease. Other than clarifying some of the partners like the Public Health Agency of Canada for a grand total of $4 million worth of funding over 5 fiscal years, but anything to do with vaccine development or research funding is likely hidden under the many redactions. During that investigation, I found out that Dr. Moore did not declare that conflict of interest with the Canadian Lyme Disease Research Network, so what gives? Does he have a conflict of interest or not? So I reached out to the office of the Integrity Commissioner of Ontario to inquire further, because it was my understanding at the time that under the conflict of interest rules in Ontario, current ministry employees and public servants employed in and appointed to public bodies were legally required to declare their conflicts of interest. Michelle Renaud responded, clarifying for me that under the Public Services of Ontario Act, the Chief Medical Officer of Health is not required to disclose a conflict of interest to the Integrity Commissioner, but rather to his ethics executive, and directs me to the Deputy Minister for the Ministry of Health, who is the ethics executive for the Chief Medical Officer of Health. Isn't that interesting? The person responsible for overseeing conflicts of interest is not an independent review board, but rather a deputy minister within the very same ministry. In the meantime, the provincial leaders of Ontario were campaigning for the election that took place on the first week of June. So I took the opportunity to ask current and now re-elected Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, if he knew about Kieran Moore's conflict of interest before he appointed him. Check it out.
Mr. Ford, do you know that Kieran Moore has financial ties with Pfizer and he sits on one of their advisory boards?
Sorry, we're going. Thanks.
Mr. Ford, were you aware of that when you appointed Kieran Moore? Would you have appointed Kieran Moore if you knew that he was direct ties with Pfizer?
Guys, he's done taking questions.
From my end, he looked like a deer in headlights, but of course he didn't answer the question, and apparently nobody else can. Now, the whole Kieran Moore conflict of interest thing is about to get convoluted and fishy, so please stay with me here as we work through it. Dr. Kieran Moore was first appointed as Chief Medical Officer of Health in June 2021, but the Deputy Minister of Health, which is who he would have declared his conflicts of interest to, is now Dr. Catherine Zahn. And she was appointed 2 months after Moore in August of 2021, which means that if, and that's still a giant if, Moore declared anything, it would have been to the previous Deputy Minister, Helen Angus. Regardless, I poked around a little bit to see what I could find about Zahn, and here is what I learned. As per her biography on the Canadian Institute of Health Research website, Zahn is one of 2 members representing Ontario in Region 3 on their board of directors. As per her appointment as Deputy Minister of Health, Zahn stepped down from her role as President and CEO of CAMH. That's an acronym for the Canadian Addictions and Mental Health, which is the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. And it was deeply embedded in the COVID vaccine campaign, even hosting their own clinics in some strange pivot to be a vaccine propagating center. The most recent CAMH report notes that Zahn is still part of the executive leadership team. On page 24 of CAMH's 2021 annual financial report, they disclose that they received $15.2 million in funding from the Ministry of Health, the MOH, and $2.6 million, quite the increase from the $500,000 that they received in 2020, recorded as received from the MOH related to expenditures incurred in response to the pandemic. In addition, apparently the CAMH hospital received $4.4 million as it acted as an agent for the MOH in respect of distributing the pay to staff and physicians. An agent of the MHO, you don't say. Based on the 2019-2020 annual report, when Zahn was still president and CEO of CAMH, it looks like they received a hefty donation from Pfizer Canada for an amount over, we have no idea how much exactly, but over $100,000. Pfizer is listed as a donor under the COVID-19 Mental Health and Resiliency Fund as well. There's also an entity listed as anonymous who donated over $100 million. I wonder who that is. In more coincidental connections, as far back as 2012, Zahn was introduced by Sean Kelly, the Vice President of Public Affairs at Pfizer Canada, at a Toronto Region Board of Trade event. But back to this conflict of interest, if it's even formally declared anywhere other than by Moore in that panelist video. Presumably, if it was declared to the ministry, as I believe it very well should have been, given that Moore was instrumental in advising the Ford government to implement vaccine passports, then that information should be easily transferred over and would be readily documented and available for review by Zahn. So I've emailed both Zahn and called. At first, I contacted the media contact for the Ministry of Health asking for Dr. Zahn's direct contact, as I had some difficulty locating it online. There was no response. So I was able to obtain her email address, and I asked, does Dr. Moore have a declared conflict of interest filed? Do you manage and/or disclose the financial amounts associated with conflicts of interest? If so, what is the total financial amount associated with Dr. Moore's Pfizer connection? How has the ministry rationalized Dr. Moore's advice on vaccine passports with his ties as a Pfizer advisory board member? To be expected from an unelected bureaucrat, I did not receive a response by my deadline, and still, even weeks later, I have not received a response. So I decided to call the number listed on the employee directory. But before I did that, I filed another access to information request. In this one, specifically targeted to the Ontario Ministry, I asked for all files and documents pertaining to a declared conflict of interest either for or by Kieran Moore. To support this ongoing investigation, you can chip in at rebelinvestigates.com. Now, the number listed for Zahn goes straight to a voicemail and then redirects to her secretary, who I guess is Lisa Benvenuto, who apparently has been on vacation for a month and will return June 21st. So I waited until the week of June 21st, and I've called every day since then, but it still says the same thing. Have a listen.
Hi, you've reached Lisa Benvenuto at the Ministry of Health, Office of the Deputy Minister, Dr. Kieran Moore. Please note that I am away from the office from May the 24th to June the 21st, and that my voicemail messages are not being monitored.
I also called Christine Elliott's office trying to track down Zahn too. See, Christine Elliott is the only elected official in this twisty turning story, and her secretary actually returned my call, and here's how that went. I'm looking to speak with Deputy Minister Catherine Zahn, and I'm having a difficult time garnering a contact there, so I was hoping that the minister's office could help.
So you can go by her email, first name, and then first name .zain@ontario.ca.
So I have a contact, the email contact as catherine.zahn@ontario.ca. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And so if she doesn't respond to me, what protocols are in place to garner a response?
Maybe, no, but she's not in the office today, so maybe she will. When did you send it?
On Thursday, June the 9th.
So just give her some time and then she'll be back to you, maybe.
Now I've tried following up and left another voice message for the secretary at Christine Elliott's office that I've given Zahn plenty of time, and no one from Elliott's office is returning my calls at this point either. I have decided that since Zahn's secretary seems to be in a perpetual state of vacationing, I would contact those that were outlined in the voice message. So I also emailed the secretary, and in that email, despite her continual vacation mode, I included Dane Nelson, the Director of Policy and Delivery, and Amy Best, who is the acting manager at the Deputy Minister's office. To recoup this investigation, I've contacted more directly. I've asked Doug Ford, I've asked Catherine Zahn, her secretary, her acting manager, her Director of Policy, and Christine Elliott's secretary. That's 7 bureaucrats. How many bureaucrats does it take to get a response? Apparently more than 7, and at least 2 access to information requests. For Rebel News, I'm Tamara Ugolini. 7 bureaucrats and 2 ATIPs later, let's see what this investigation finds. I want to see all documents pertaining to any conflict of interest declarations submitted by or for Dr. Kieran Moore, the expert responsible for divisive, unethical, and unscientific vaccine mandates, to continue to support my investigative journalism efforts to determine whether or not Kieran Moore declared his own proclaimed conflict of interest. Please consider chipping in at rebelinvestigates.com. That website again is rebelinvestigates.com.